Welcome to this session. It's called Kitchen Sink Won't Help with Nausea, plus an additional Droperidol, the emergency physician's best friend. We'll see if you agree or not. This is largely the same talk that I held at SWESEM a couple of months ago, so if anyone saw that presentation, repetition is the mother of all learning. Also have a vague memory of talking about this at some previous suites. Nonetheless, I do believe that what I'm about to reveal is news to most of you. If I'm wrong, that will be fantastic, because that would mean that scientific evidence would finally be proven to be able to break the chains of culture. We'll see. No conflicts of interest to declare. I'm going to spend the next 12 to 14 minutes to try to convince you to stop giving drugs to your patients, only to sort of use 5-6 minutes to convince you to start giving another drug, perhaps, for these same patients. I'll link to all the references for this talk at the end, so you can use this QR code to get to all those references if you're interested. Let's just begin with discussing who I want you to stop giving drugs to, and maybe more importantly, why. Nausea is extremely common in our emergency departments, and the suffering it causes is substantial. Some patients would even grade experiencing nausea worse than experiencing pain. So it's not particularly surprising that antiemetics are very commonly prescribed in our emergency departments, only second to analgesics. And looking at individual drugs, ondansetron is in fact the most prescribed drug of all globally. So it's amazing. It's just very, very used. One would think that with so much suffering and so many antiemetics being prescribed that this is supported by solid scientific evidence, right? But it's not. And this is where you go, yeah, but is anything that we do really supported by solid scientific evidence? And you would have a point. Like most of the time, whatever we do, we lack the big sort of really reliable RCTs that prove that we're doing something beneficial to our patients, and we have to rely on observational studies, smaller case reports, or even sometimes expert opinion. That's our reality. But that's not the case in nausea. In nausea, we have a multitude of RCTs done, some of them with really good quality. The problem is that they all tell us our medication isn't working. It wasn't until the 21st century that researchers really started to investigate whether antiemetics work for emergency patients. I guess everyone just assumed that they would, partly because they're called antiemetics, right? And partly because they do work in some other circumstances, in preventing post-operative nausea, for instance. In 2010, Peter Rosen himself oversaw this review aimed at identifying all RCTs investigating antiemetics treatment for nausea, vomiting in adults in emergency departments. They found only 4 studies. In this one, prochlorperazine was slightly better than promethazine, but this study was not placebo-controlled. In this one, compared different doses of metoclopramide and found that 10 milligrams was equally efficacious as weight-based doses. Again, no placebo group. So the first placebo-controlled study was published in 2006. Here, droperidol was actually significantly more effective than placebo, but 22 patients in that group. Metoclopramide and prochlorperazine weren't. The 4th study compared ondansetron to promethazine. None were better than the other. A couple of years later, A Cochrane analysis was done in 2015, and they were able to include 4 additional studies on top of the previously known. The total number of ED patients with nausea who had been included in an RCT at that time was 952, so almost 1,000 patients, not too bad. Among the new studies, this 2011 trial introduced a new drug that never seemed to catch on, Droperidol. Is there anyone no one familiar with that? No one giving it? It sort of fell out. I've only seen it in this study. There was actually a bit less vomiting going on in the Droperidol group. 2 versus 9 patients had vomited a median of 1 time at 2 hours, if that makes sense. But in terms of reducing nausea, there was no statistically significant difference. The same year, this study had some more patients vomiting in the ondansetron group compared to the prochlorperazine group. And prochlorperazine was a bit better at reducing nausea at 1 and 2 hours. A third 2011 study, very hot topic in 2011, Barrett and colleagues set out to produce the largest RCT study ever made. This was very ambitious. They aimed to include 600 patients in their study, and it was placebo-controlled. All drugs performed equally bad against placebo. They initially expected, as I said, to include 600 patients in 18 months' time, but at 17 months they'd only included 30% of that amount, so they had to do an interim analysis to see if it was worthwhile to additionally to add more patients to this study, but that analysis concluded that it was futile to do so. It wouldn't reach statistical significance for any drug. So this is the box plot that they presented. Not a sort of expert in statistics, but to me it just looks like it's all over the place for all 4 groups. Anyway, 2014, they added another study. It was actually probably better in terms of quality. No statistically significant difference between ondansetron, metoclopramide, and placebo. All put together, the conclusion of the Cochrane analysis was sobering. There is no definitive evidence to support the superiority of any drug over the other or any drug over placebo. However, there was always some critique coming to this conclusion, and Robert Meek, who actually co-authored the Cochrane analysis as one of the better RCTs that was included in it, he said, yeah, but maybe relying on the visual analog scale sort of obscures the subtle differences. I'm quite convinced that antiemetics work. He had done some research on how to accurately measure nausea in the emergency department. So he felt if we just measure differently, we'll make this sort of be proven. So he set out to do this new state-of-the-art RCT in 2017. He opted to compare Droperidol and ondansetron, the most sort of promising drugs, against placebo. All the right primary and secondary outcomes rigged, methodology was solid, planned to enroll 378 patients, but they had to stop the trial early. After enrolling 215 patients, they did an interim analysis, found no point in going on, no statistical difference for any drug. I don't think this is Robert Meek, by the way. Just found this picture on the internet. He looks very determined, so felt it was appropriate. I couldn't find a picture of a disappointed Robert Meek here, but this should have really ended the debate. A perfect RCT having to shut down early. But the studies continued to emerge. It was as if it was impossible for us physicians to accept that our drugs aren't helping the patients. So Philpott 2023 compared Droperidol and ondansetron at higher doses than Robert Meek did. no difference. And they, by the way, they didn't have a placebo group here, but the drugs performed equally. So what should we make of all this? All of these studies just prove that our drugs aren't working. But they do show another interesting finding. So if we change perspective for a minute and just look at all the graphs in all the articles, it reveals that at 30 minutes, almost everyone, at least if you group them together, have a significant reduction in their experience of nausea. So just, it seems like entering the ED, half an hour later, you feel much better. So it's really the key takeaway is that most people feel better coming to the emergency department, whether this is for our symptomatic treatment, it might be fluid boluses doing this, or treating a co-occurrent pain, comforting the patient, whatever it is, it's unknown. But this is really important to understand, that a nauseated patient will very likely feel much better just by the other things that we do for this patient. Do I still give antiemetics? Yeah, sometimes, and probably so does Robert Meek. I mean, the urge to alleviate suffering is so strong, and you see someone in front of you, you want to provide something for them. But knowing this, reading all the studies, we should really sort of push that urge away to give antiemetics, focus on the supportive treatment, and in that way we'll stop the patient from having the side effects of an ineffective drug that we're giving them, and will uphold our Hippocratic oath to do no harm. This is the link to the references. There will be another link later. But is there any questions about the nausea part of this presentation? We have a question there. We have a microphone. Yeah. And you're very welcome to speak Swedish. It's just presenting is much more comfortable in English.
Jag undrar, hörs jag? Isopropylalkohol, dök det upp i studierna? Och var det lika meningslöst?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, there's some emerging evidence that you can use alcoholic swabs, isopropyl alcohol, for nausea. Those studies are mostly on mild nausea, so not really the sort of profuse vomiting patient or acutely nauseated patient, but they show some promise. So yeah, it's worth trying. I'm not sure. I can't remember if there are any placebo. I think there are some placebo-controlled studies on that as well. Okay. So treatment of hypovolemia as a cause of nausea, it's, as far as I know, it hasn't been studied. It's one of the things that most authors want to happen in the future. We should probably study how the fluid that we're giving all these patients influence nausea, because obviously there has to be a good reason for this good effect of coming to the emergency department. So one hypothesis is that giving fluid boluses to these patients would be good. I would agree, good nursing and just feeling sort of safe in a safer environment. And I think there's a component of treating the co-occurrent pain, because obviously, you know, kidney stone people, they have a lot of nausea associated to their pain. That goes with headaches and other pains as well. So if you treat the pain, most people will feel better with the nausea in that as well.
Såg man någon skillnad beroende på orsak till illamåendet? Jag menar, det kan vara bieffekt av morfin, eller det kan vara en yrsel, eller det kan vara smärta.
Yeah. So I mean, whether or not this nausea was associated to anything specific, none of these studies focused on one specific subgroup of these, the gastroenteritis only or something like that. Most just sort of grouped ED patients together. So that's one thing. If we're not really convinced about these sort of 1,000 patients, maybe there are subgroups that would benefit. We'll actually, at the very end, we'll talk about ondansetron in the pediatric population. there we have some solid evidence that it does work. That hasn't been shown for adult patients. But yeah, obviously, if you feel up to it, you could do an RCT on a specific subgroup and see if we have any effect. But for all subgroups, almost everyone feels much better. All right, I'll move on to droperidol now. So droperidol is the first generation antipsychotic that has been around for around 50 years. Despite being an antipsychotic, the main indication have been, historically anyway, has been the prevention of and treatment of post-operative nausea and vomiting. For decades, this was a very trusted drug by anaesthetists and emergency physicians for different indications. But in 2001, in the States, its reputation was a bit tarnished because the FDA issued a black box warning due to concerns about QT prolongation and the risk of subsequent arrhythmias. So this led to almost no one using the drug for a couple of decades, or at least 1 decade, because we couldn't be bothered taking an ECG before and after giving this drug. The FDA's decision to implement this black box warning has been widely criticized, and multiple studies have shown that QT prolongation risk and the incident of torsade de pointes was very overstated and largely based on unsubstantiated reports. More recent research have demonstrated that QT prolongation from droperidol is not clinically relevant in the doses that we use in emergency care. Several prospective studies have also verified this. The links are for all the references at the end, as I said, but this one just is an example of the historic data. So multiple researchers have had very difficult to identify any incident of arrhythmia or torsade in this historic material. And this is perhaps the most promising prospective study. They had 1,403 agitated patients, and they got quite high doses of droperidol, 10 milligrams up to 20 milligrams. They had 13 cases of QT prolongation and 0 cases of torsade. Despite these findings, restoring droperidol's reputation and reintroducing it to common practice has been quite slow. And this might be explained in several different ways. One might be that we still feel a bit afraid that something bad might happen when we use it. I hope I've been able to prove that that's not true. The other explanation might be that we're unsure of when to use it. It's been gone for so long, so we have developed alternative strategies for treating the indications that it's relevant for. So let's have a look at that. One of the indications for droperidol in emergency care is, with strong evidence, I would add, is the safe and effective treatment of sedation in agitation. It can be used and is being used in all ages, including adolescents. And the doses we typically use is 5 to 10 milligrams intramuscularly, and that's both safe and effective in about 75 to 85% of the cases. In this meta-analysis, only including RCTs, they concluded that droperidol is probably equally effective to ketamine and probably more effective than midazolam and other alternatives. More importantly, perhaps, it seems to be safer than most alternatives, even though the evidence for this is, if you only look at RCTs, it's not conclusive. My personal experience is that it's quite effective. It's my first line of drug for this indication, unless, as we heard yesterday, the Giftinformationscentralen lecture, if you have this bodybuilder going berserk in the emergency department, I tend to use ketamine instead. Looking at data from observational studies like this, for instance, thousands of patients have received 5 to 10 milligrams of droperidol, again with no cases of torsade reported. And there's also notably few other adverse side effects. This is an American study, so they have an intubation rate of 1%, so that perhaps would be a bit lower in the European data. Leaving agitation and talking about another indication with strong evidence is headache, and specifically migraine, but it's also been shown for other benign headaches. So the doses range from 0.625 to 2.5, but usually 1.25 to 2.5 is most commonly used. And the studies report a significant reduction in headache in 73 to 88% of the cases. This review included 5 RCTs and concluded that droperidol is an effective alternative when treating migraine in the ED. And other studies have found it to be equally effective in other types of primary headaches. This was actually a quite interesting study that I stumbled upon from New Zealand. They apparently have been using droperidol intranasally. Is there anyone that uses droperidol intranasally? No? Me neither, but I'll definitely try that after reading this study. So they referred to a pharmacological study that showed that the bioavailability is good for the intranasal route for droperidol, and they were able to show shorter length of stay for the patients if that route was used compared to the IV route. So it's quite promising. No RCT, but historical data. So to me, with headaches, I use it as almost my primary route. Obviously, if the patient has tried the usual things with NSAIDs or something like that, come in late in the ED after a day or two of headache, I go to droperidol straight away. And I would agree just with the percentages there. Most patients would have some effect. Some of them would be completely pain-free after a short episode. Most will have some decrease in the headache, and a few will not have any effect at all. So we've already ruled out droperidol to treat nausea, but it's one of the traditional sort of indication, and it works in other settings. So if I absolutely feel that I have to give something after that sort of first half hour of supportive care, I usually use droperidol for this. We have 4 placebo-controlled trials on antiemetics, as we mentioned, and droperidol is in 2 of them. And in both studies, it actually shows some benefit. In one, the primary outcome was better, and the second, some secondary outcomes were better. So it's really the most promising drug, anyway. And it's also shown promise in cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome and gastroparesis, which would then speak to some efficacy with nausea. Another thing that you could use droperidol for is pain. This is less studied, but in historical data, it seems like physicians use it for pain, specifically in the States most of the time. In this study, it was aiming to sort of evaluate the effectiveness and safety of droperidol in ED patients as a group, and they found that 20% of the time physicians had the indication pain for choosing droperidol, other than headaches then. In half of the cases, the pain resolved and the need of rescue medication was rare. So droperidol may be used alternatively to manage pain, especially cases with where opioids aren't really an option, or perhaps opioid-dependent patients. There's one study here. Let's see if that's the one. Right, yeah. So this study compared patients that repeatedly emerged in the ED with ongoing abdominal pain. If they had one session where they didn't receive droperidol and one session where they actually had some droperidol, they were able to compare those events, and they found that on the occasion that patient received droperidol, they had less morphine. So it tends to be opioid sparing, and there's some other evidence that points to this effect as well in pain. But we don't have any RCTs that I'm aware of. So concluding this for droperidol, it's a quite versatile, very safe and effective option for managing a wide range of conditions in emergency setting. Agitation, headache, other types of pain, and even sometimes nausea, perhaps. Safety profile is excellent, so that's sort of a very good thing to know that you could always try it. And so this is the study when we're sort of turning to the pediatric population and vomiting. We've been talking a lot of nausea and not so much about vomiting, because vomiting events in the adult population wouldn't be as significant because obviously we compensate better than children, but in the pediatric population it's can become a quite acute problem if the patient vomits repeatedly. They'll be dehydrated and electrolyte disturbances and all that. So we do want to treat that. And we have solid evidence that ondansetron in these settings is effective. It decreases the number of vomiting episodes and facilitates oral fluid rehydration treatment. So in that case, use ondansetron hasn't been shown to have the same effect for the adults, unfortunately. And finally, I just had to show you this. This is a RCT. When I checked if there was any new RCTs in this area for this lecture, the randomized controlled snakes trial. Love it. It's beautiful. So they gave candy jelly snakes to pediatric patients waking up after tonsillectomy, and were hoping that this would decrease the number of vomiting episodes. It didn't. But yeah. Right. Brilliant. Feel free just to have a look at the references if you need, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. In the back, let's get you a mic. 1 and 2, yeah, okay.
Hej, Erik Andersson, specialist på Östra Göteborg. Droperidol har inte fått fotfäste i Sverige lika mycket som haloperidol. Har det gjorts några jämförelsestudier i någon indikation med droperidol och haloperidol?
Yeah. So they're very similar drugs in some aspect, and when it comes to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, we do have some studies on haloperidol being quite effective. I sort of more want droperidol to be effective on that rather than having really solid RCTs on it. So far, if you really want to follow the evidence, you should possibly use haloperidol for that indication. For headaches, I'm not sure. I don't think haloperidol is studied that much, but I'm not sure about that. For agitation, it's slower and it's less effective than droperidol. Any last question? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. One final question there. Yeah. Just use the mic for the recordings, please.
A lot of the agitated patients we will suspect they have a substance abuse as well.
Yeah.
What about the safety with those?
Yeah, so it's completely safe in the doses that we use on a broad material of patients coming in with agitation for all different kinds of reasons. Yeah. Thank you.